was a time when I was lying in bed night after night, crying in a way that felt like it had no end. I felt sick most of the time, not just emotionally, but physically, like something was constantly sitting heavy in my chest. I would look in the mirror and barely recognize myself. I looked older, more tired, worn down in a way that wasn't just about sleep. My marriage was falling apart, and the hardest part was that I couldn't understand why. I kept asking the same questions over and over. Why is this happening to me? Why can't I fix this? What am I doing wrong? And every time I asked them, it felt like I went deeper into the same place. More confusion, more helplessness, more of that same heavy feeling. At the time, I thought I was trying to find answers. Looking back, I can see something else. My mind was answering me. Not in words I could clearly hear, but in the way everything felt, in what I noticed, in how stuck everything seemed. Every question I asked seemed to lead me back to the same conclusion, that something was wrong, that I couldn't fix it, that I was somehow failing. And the more I asked those questions, the more real that became. I'd been using affirmations before that in the way most of us do, trying to shift how I felt by saying something better. I am strong. I am calm. I am at peace. But if I'm honest, they never really landed. I would say the words, but underneath them, there was always something else. A quiet resistance, a sense that what I was saying didn't match what I was living. And I thought that meant I needed to try harder, to believe more, to repeat them more often. But it never quite worked. Because the problem wasn't that I didn't want to feel different. It was that my mind wasn't responding to what I was telling it. It was responding to something else entirely. Then one night, in the middle of all that, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a quiet change in direction. Instead of asking why this was happening to me, I asked something I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. Why am I so happy and at peace on my own? I didn't know the answer. I didn't even fully understand the question. But something in me went quiet when I asked it. Not fixed, not suddenly better, but steady. As if my mind had been given something it could finally move toward instead of something it had to defend against. And slowly things began to come clearer. Not easier, but clearer. I started to see what I'd been avoiding, what I hadn't wanted to admit, what I'd been trying to fix instead of face. That it was over, that there'd been betrayal, that no amount of trying on my part was going to change that. And somehow, instead of breaking me, that clarity gave me something I hadn't had before. Direction. Because once I could see it, I could respond to it. That question didn't fix my life, but it changed what I was looking at. And that changed everything that followed. It gave me the courage to leave, to face what I hadn't wanted to see, to rebuild my life in a way that felt honest, even if it was uncomfortable. To move, quite literally, back to France and begin again. Not because I suddenly felt ready, but because I was no longer asking questions that kept me stuck. It took me a long time to realize that this wasn't a failure of discipline. It wasn't that I wasn't trying hard enough, or repeating the affirmations often enough, or believing deeply enough. It was something quieter than that. My mind simply wasn't accepting what I was telling it. There's a strange experience that happens when you say something that doesn't yet feel true. Part of you leans into it, and another part almost instantly pulls back. You might not even hear the words clearly, but you feel the contradiction. A subtle sense of, that's not quite right. I thought that feeling was something to push through, that if I kept going, eventually the words would land, that belief would follow repetition. But the more I paid attention, the more I noticed something else. My mind wasn't being difficult, it was being precise. It was holding on to what I already knew, to everything I'd experienced, repeated and reinforced up until that point. And when I said something that didn't match that, it didn't absorb it, it questioned it. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to keep it at a distance. Looking back, I can see that I was trying to overwrite something too quickly, trying to replace a belief without acknowledging what was already there, and my mind, quietly, was refusing to cooperate. We often talk about mindset as something we can consciously change with the right tools. But there is a part of us that doesn't respond to force. A part that doesn't accept a statement just because we've decided it should be true. And the more I sat with this, the more I realized something I hadn't expected. The issue wasn't what I was saying, it was the format. Affirmations are declarations. They are statements of truth spoken as though they already exist. And if they don't feel true yet, something in us resists them. Not because we're negative, but because we're coherent. Your mind is always trying to keep a consistent story. It draws from memory, experience, repetition. It doesn't just accept a new statement because it sounds better. It checks it quietly, constantly. So when you say, I am calm, but your body is tense, your thoughts are racing, and your day has been anything but calm. Something doesn't align, and your mind notices that. Not loudly, but enough to stop the words from settling. I thought I needed to say better things, stronger things, more convincing things. But the more I explored this, the more I began to question something else entirely. What if my mind wasn't responding to statements the way I thought it should? What if it wasn't designed to simply accept what I told it? And that's when I started to notice a different pattern. Not in what I was saying, but in what I was asking. Because without realizing it, we are always asking ourselves questions, quietly throughout the day. Why does this feel so hard? Why am I like this? Why can't I get this right? And unlike affirmations, those questions never seemed to be resisted. They landed immediately, and more than that, they were answered. Not always consciously, but in the way my attention moved, in what I noticed, what I focused on, what felt reinforced. It was as though my mind wasn't just listening, it was responding, and that's where something began to shift. Because if my mind was already answering the questions I was asking, whether I realized it or not, then perhaps the real influence wasn't in what I declared, but in what I directed it toward. This is where everything started to open up for me, not through forcing belief, but through understanding how attention works. Your mind is not passive. It is constantly scanning, filtering, selecting. Not everything you see reaches you in the same way. Not everything you experience is held with the same weight. Your attention decides what stands out. And your attention is guided, often quietly, by the questions you carry. So if the questions are unhelpful, your experience begins to reflect that. Not because something is wrong, but because your mind is doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's answering you. And once I saw that, it became difficult to ignore, because it meant that I wasn't just thinking. I was directing something that was shaping how I experienced my own life. This is where I began to move away from affirmations, not because they're useless, but because they weren't working in the way I thought they would. This was another way of working with my mind, one that didn't require me to force belief, one that felt quieter, but more effective. And it didn't start with saying something new. It started with asking something different. This is something I'm going to explore more deeply in the next piece, because it changes not just how you think, but how you notice, respond, and move throughout your day. I'll link it here once it's live so you can follow the thread. For now, it might be just enough to notice this. Not what you're telling yourself, but what you're asking, often without realizing it. Because your mind is already listening and it's already answering. What questions have you been quietly asking yourself lately? Georgia.